That night, the city heard nothing. But the girl's voice, small, broken, desperate, echoed through dimensions older than stone. And somewhere in the dark, something massive opened its eyes. They should have left her mother alone. The rain fell like broken glass over the decaying streets of South Boston. It was a kind of rain that didn't cleanse. It stained. It soaked into the cracked pavement, pooled in the gutters where trash floated like forgotten prayers, and drummed against the boarded windows of buildings that had long since given up on being homes. The apartment complex at 47th, and Mercer was one of those places, a relic of urban decay. 6 stories of peeling paint, rusted fire escapes, and doors that didn't lock properly anymore. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions, didn't make eye contact, didn't get involved. Survival meant silence. But on this particular October evening, that silence was about to shatter. She appeared just after dusk. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, stood at the entrance of the building. Her clothes were too thin for the cold, a faded pink sweater with a hole near the collar, jeans stained at the knees, and sneakers held together with duct tape. Her dark hair clung to her face in wet strands, and her eyes, huge brown, rimmed with exhaustion, stared up at the building as if it were a mountain she had no strength left to climb. She had been walking for hours. Her name was Emma, and she was terrified. Behind her, the street was empty. No cars, no witnesses, just a hum of distant traffic and the flicker of a broken streetlight that cast her shadow long and crooked against the concrete. Emma's small hands trembled as she pushed open the heavy door. It groaned on its hinges, the sound swallowed immediately by the stale air inside. The lobby smelled like mildew and cigarette smoke. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. She walked to the center of the room and stopped. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her chest rose and fell too quickly. She looked around, at the peeling wallpaper, the broken mailboxes, the staircase that led up into darkness. And then she did something that no child should ever have to do. She called out for help. Please. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracking under the weight of fear. Someone, please. No one answered. The building was full of people. She could hear them, muffled voices through walls, the thump of footsteps on floors above, a television playing too loud somewhere down the hall. But no doors opened. No one came. Emma's lip quivered. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. They want to hurt my mom, she said louder now, her voice breaking. She's sick. She can't fight them. Please, somebody. Still nothing. She sank to her knees on the filthy tile floor, her small body folding in on itself. Her hands clutched at her sweater, twisting the fabric as sobs began to choke their way out of her throat. Please. And then he heard her. In the basement of the building, in a room no tenant had ever seen, something stirred. The space was vast, far larger than the blueprints would suggest. It shouldn't have existed. Not in a building this size, not this deep, but it did. Stone walls, no windows, a single candle burning on a table in the center, its flame motionless despite the draft that whispered through cracks in the foundation. And in the corner, seated on a throne carved from blackened wood and bone, was him, the Vampire King. His true name had been forgotten centuries ago. Those who once spoke it were dust. Now, he was simply known as Kale, a title more than a name, a legend more than a man. He was massive, even seated. His form dwarfed the furniture around him. 7 feet tall when standing, broad-shouldered, with hands that could crush stone. His skin was pale as moonlight, stretched over a frame that was both elegant and monstrous. His face was sharp, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that rarely moved, but it was his eyes that marked him as something other. Deep crimson, glowing faintly in the dark, ancient and knowing and utterly devoid of human warmth. He wore a long coat, black as tar, over a simple shirt and trousers. No crown, no jewels. He had no need for symbols of power. His presence alone was enough. For decades he had lived here, hidden, forgotten. He did not hunt. He did not kill. He fed sparingly, only when necessary, and always from those who would not be missed, predators, abusers, men who thrived on cruelty. It was a rule he had set for himself long ago, A code born from centuries of bloodshed and regret. He had been a monster once. He had no desire to be one again. So he lived in silence, in shadow, in solitude, until tonight. The moment Emma's voice reached him, Cale's eyes snapped open. He had been meditating. An old habit, a way to quiet the endless hunger that gnawed at the edges of his mind. But now, that hunger was replaced by something else. Awareness. He tilted his head, listening. The building around him was a symphony of noise, heartbeats, whispers, the creak of wood and metal. He could hear it all. He always could. But this sound was different. A child's voice. Broken. Desperate. They want to hurt my mom. Cale's jaw tightened. He rose slowly, his movements fluid despite his size. The candle flame flickered as he passed, and the shadows of the room seemed to lean toward him, drawn to him like iron to a magnet. He climbed the stairs in silence, his footsteps making no sound. Through the door, into the hallway, up another flight, and then he saw her. Emma was still on her knees in the lobby, sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands. Cale stood at the top of the staircase, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. A child, alone, afraid. Something deep inside him, something he thought he had buried long ago, stirred. Protector. The word echoed in his mind, unbidden. A memory from another life. Another time, when he had been mortal, when he had sworn oaths, when he had believed in justice. He stepped forward. Emma looked up and froze. She couldn't breathe. The figure that emerged from the darkness was impossible. Too tall, too still. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his shadow stretched across the floor like a living thing. For a moment, Emma thought she was dreaming, or dying, because nothing that looked like that could be real. But then he spoke. "Where is your mother?" His voice was low, calm. It rumbled like distant thunder, and yet it carried no threat, only certainty. Emma's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Cale took another step closer. He knelt slowly, lowering himself until he was almost at her level, though even kneeling, he towered over her. "I will not harm you," he said. His eyes met hers. "Tell me where she is." Emma swallowed hard. Her voice came out in a ragged whisper. "Fourth floor, apartment 4C, they're hurting her." Cale's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Men," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "Bad men. They came for money. But she doesn't have it. She's sick. She can't fight them." Cale's expression didn't change. But something in the air around him shifted. The temperature dropped. The candle in the basement, 3 floors below, went out. He stood. "Stay here," he said. And then he was gone. Emma blinked. One moment he was there. The next he wasn't. She stared at the empty space where he had been, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. And then, from somewhere above, she heard it. A scream. The 4th floor hallway was narrow, lit by a single bulb that flickered like a dying heartbeat. The walls were stained with years of neglect, water damage, graffiti, handprints no one had bothered to clean. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something sharper, fear. Apartment 4C was at the end of the hall. The door hung slightly ajar, splintered near the lock where it had been kicked open. From inside came muffled voices, men's voices, low and cruel, punctuated by the sound of something heavy being overturned. And beneath it all, a woman's quiet sobbing. Cale stood just outside the door, his massive frame filling the narrow corridor. His head was tilted slightly, listening, calculating. 3 men inside. 1 woman. Heartbeats uneven. Hers weak, theirs elevated with adrenaline and aggression. He could smell blood. His jaw clenched. Without hesitation, Cale pushed the door open. The apartment was small. A single room serving as kitchen, living space, and bedroom all at once. A threadbare couch sat against one wall. A mattress on the floor in the corner. A tiny stove with 2 burners, one of them broken. The window was cracked, covered with a sheet that billowed slightly in the draft. And in the center of it all, chaos. 2 men stood near the overturned table. The first was tall and wiry, with a shaved head and a tattoo snaking up his neck. He held a crowbar loosely in one hand. The second was shorter, stockier, with a patchy beard and dead eyes. He was rifling through a cardboard box, tossing its contents, bills, photographs, a child's drawings, onto the floor. The third man stood over the woman. She was on her knees, one hand pressed against her side, where a bruise was already forming. Her face was gaunt, pale, her cheeks hollow from sickness and starvation. Her hair hung in limp strands around her face. She looked up at the man with eyes that had long since stopped, hoping for mercy. The man, older, with graying hair and a cruel smile, grabbed her by the chin, forcing her to look at him. "Where's the money, sweetheart?" he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You know how this works. You pay or—" He didn't finish the sentence, because suddenly he wasn't holding her anymore. Suddenly, he was flying backward across the room. The crash was deafening. The man slammed into the far wall with enough force to crack the plaster. He crumpled to the floor, gasping, eyes wide with shock and pain. The other two men spun around and froze. Standing in the doorway was something out of a nightmare. Cale didn't speak. He needed to. His eyes burned crimson in the dim light. His coat billowed slightly, though there was no wind. And his presence, God, his presence, filled the room like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The man with the crowbar found his voice first. Who the hell are you?" Cale stepped inside. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click. "Leave," he said. One word. Calm. Final. The stocky man laughed nervously. "You gotta be kidding me, man. You know who we work for? You know what happens if we—" Cale moved. One moment he was by the door. The next, he was standing directly in front of the man. The laughter died in the man's throat. Up close, Cale was even more terrifying. His eyes bored into the man's skull, and his hand, massive, pale, impossibly strong, wrapped around the man's throat and lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. "I will not ask again," Cale said softly. The man's face turned purple. His feet kicked uselessly in the air. His eyes bulged, and then Cale dropped him. The man collapsed, coughing and gasping, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. The one with the crowbar raised it, his hands shaking. "Stay back. Cale's gaze shifted to him. The man stopped mid-sentence. The crowbar slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He ran, straight past Cale, out the door down the hall. The sound of his footsteps echoed and faded. The stocky man followed, half crawling, half stumbling over the threshold. That left only one. The older man, the leader, had dragged himself upright. His hand went to his waistband, pulling out a knife. "You made a mistake," he hissed. His voice was venomous, but his hands trembled. "You have no idea what you just—" Cale was in front of him before the sentence finished. His hand closed around the man's wrist. There was a sharp crack, bone breaking, and the knife fell. The man screamed. Cale leaned in close, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the man's very bones. "If you return, if you touch her, if you so much as think of her daughter again," his eyes flared brighter, "I will find you, and you will beg for the mercy I will not give." The man's face went white. Cale released him. The man stumbled backward, clutching his broken wrist, and fled without another word. Silence. Cale stood in the center of the ruined apartment, his chest rising and falling slowly. The room smelled like sweat and fear and blood. He turned. The woman was still on the floor, staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Cale knelt. "You are safe," he said quietly. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. And then, finally, she whispered, "What were you?" Cale's expression softened, just barely. "A remnant," he said. "Nothing more." He stood, moved to the door, and paused. "Your daughter is downstairs. She is waiting for you." And then he was gone. Emma was exactly where he had left her. She looked up as Cale descended the stairs, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Is she okay?" Emma whispered. Cale nodded once. "She is safe." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were different. relief, gratitude. She stood, wiped her face with her sleeve, and looked up at the giant before her. "Thank you," she said softly. Cale said nothing. He simply watched as she turned and ran toward the staircase, her small footsteps echoing upward, and for the first time in decades, Cale felt something stir in his chest. Something he had thought long dead. Purpose. 3 days passed. The city moved on, as cities do. The rain stopped. The streets dried. People went to work, came home, locked their doors, and pretended the world outside was safe. Sirens wailed in the distance. Garbage trucks rumbled through alleys. The subway screeched beneath the pavement, carrying thousands of souls who never looked each other in the eye. Life continued its relentless march forward. But inside apartment 4C, everything had changed. Emma's mother, her name was Sarah, had not left the apartment since that night. Not because she was afraid, not entirely, but because she didn't know what to do with what she had seen. A monster had saved her. No, not a monster. Something else. She sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the cracked window, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The way he had appeared, not walking, not running, but simply there, as if the shadows themselves had given him form. The way the men who had terrorized her for months, who had beaten her, threatened her, made her life a waking nightmare, had fled like children running from the dark. The way his voice had been calm, almost gentle, even as he broke bones and shattered wills. "What are you?" she had asked, and he had answered, "A remnant." What did that mean? Sarah didn't know, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. The word echoed in her mind. Remnant, a fragment, a piece of something that once was whole, something left behind after everything else had been destroyed. What had he been before? What had made him into that? And why? Why had he helped them? Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the ache in her ribs where bruises were finally starting to fade. Her body was healing. Slowly. The fever that had burned through her for weeks had broken. She could breathe without pain now, could stand without the room spinning. But her mind couldn't stop circling back to those glowing red eyes, to the impossible strength in those pale hands, to the certainty in his voice when he said, "You are safe." She believed him, and that terrified her almost as much as the men who had come to hurt her. Emma, meanwhile, had become fixated. She sat at the small table near the window, drawing on the back of old envelopes with a pencil worn down to a nub. The apartment was quiet except for the scratch of graphite on paper and the distant hum of the refrigerator. But she wasn't drawing flowers or rainbows like other children might. She was drawing him, page after page. The tall figure with impossibly broad shoulders, the glowing eyes that burned like embers in the dark, the long coat that seemed to move like smoke, billowing even when there was no wind. She drew him standing in doorways, emerging from shadows, his hands outstretched, not in threat, but in protection. Sarah watched her daughter work, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. Pride, fear, confusion, gratitude. "Emma," Sarah said softly, "sweetheart, maybe you should—" "I want to thank him," Emma said, not looking up. Her small hand moved with surprising precision, adding detail to the figure's face. Sharp features, high cheekbones, an expression that was somehow both fierce and sad. Sarah's chest tightened. "Honey, I don't think." "He saved you." Emma finally looked up, her brown eyes fierce and certain. "He saved us. And I didn't even say thank you properly." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, to say it was dangerous, to say they should leave well enough alone, to say that things like him, creatures that move through darkness and stop bullets with their skin, were not meant to be thanked, not meant to be approached, not meant to be known. But then she looked at her daughter's face, so small, so determined, so impossibly brave, and couldn't find the words. Because Emma was right. He had saved them, and they owed him everything. What would you say to him? Sarah asked quietly. Emma looked back at her drawing. That he's not a monster. That I'm not afraid. That... She paused, biting her lip. That I think he's lonely. Sarah blinked. Lonely? Yeah. Emma's voice was soft now, thoughtful, the way he looked at us. like he couldn't remember the last time someone talked to him, like he'd been alone for a really, really long time. Sarah stared at her daughter, wondering, not for the first time, how someone so young could see so clearly. That evening, Emma made her decision. She waited until her mother fell asleep, exhausted from illness and fear and the weight of everything they'd been through. Sarah's breathing grew slow and even. Her face finally relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. Emma slipped out of bed carefully, pulling on her worn sneakers and her pink sweater with a hole in the collar. She grabbed a small piece of folded paper she'd been working on, a note written in her careful, childish handwriting. The apartment door creaked slightly as she opened it. She froze, glancing back at her mother. Sarah didn't stir. Emma stepped into the hallway and closed the door softly behind her. The building was quiet. Most of the tenants had gone to bed. The hallways were dark, lit only by the occasional flickering bulb that cast long, wavering shadows on the stained walls. Somewhere above, a television played too loud. Somewhere below, a couple argued in muffled, angry tones. But Emma barely noticed. She descended the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the banister, the other clutching the folded paper like a talisman. Her heart beat fast, not from fear exactly, but from anticipation, from determination. She had to do this. She had to thank him. She didn't know where he lived, but she had a feeling. The basement. She had never been down there. None of the tenants had. The door was always locked, and there was a sign, faded and peeling, that said, "Authorized personnel only." But tonight, when Emma reached out and tried the handle, it opened. The hinges creaked softly. Beyond the door, darkness waited. Emma hesitated for just a moment. Then she stepped through. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, the steps uneven with age. The air grew colder with each step she descended. Emma's breath came out in faint clouds, visible even in the darkness. She should have been afraid. Any rational child would have been. But Emma had looked into the eyes of monsters before, human monsters, with cruel smiles and hard fists, and she had seen something different in his eyes. Sadness, loneliness, and beneath it all, something that looked almost like kindness. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a hallway. The walls were stone, rough, ancient, far older than the building above. There were no lights, no windows, just darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. But ahead, faint and flickering, was a glow. Candlelight. Emma walked toward it, her footsteps echoing softly in confined space. The temperature continued to drop. Her fingers were starting to go numb. And then she saw him. The chamber at the end of the hallway was large, impossibly large, as if the space itself defied the laws of physics. The walls were lined with books, ancient tomes bound in leather and cloth, stacked on shelves carved directly into the stone. In the center of the room stood a table with a single candle burning, its flame perfectly still. And beyond that, in the far corner, was a throne. It was made of blackened wood and bone, intricate carvings covering every surface. Symbols Emma didn't recognize. Scenes of battles and kingdoms long fallen, faces that seemed to watch her as she entered. And seated upon it was Cale. He sat perfectly still, his massive frame making the throne look almost small. His eyes were closed, his hands resting on the armrests. His chest rose and fell so slowly it seemed almost as if he weren't breathing at all. He looked like a statue carved from marble, beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman. Emma stopped in the doorway, suddenly afraid. Not of him, exactly, but of disturbing something sacred, something ancient. But then Cale's eyes opened, slowly, deliberately, and they fixed on her. Those crimson eyes, glowing faintly in the candlelight, met hers with an intensity that should have been terrifying. But Emma didn't run. "You should not be here," Cale said quietly. His voice was low, resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire chamber. Emma swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. I want to say thank you." Cale's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze shifted, softened, perhaps, though it was hard to tell. "You already did." "No," Emma said, stepping forward. Her legs trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. She held out the folded paper with both hands, like an offering. I wanted to really say it. Cale stared at the note for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy and expectant. Then, slowly, so slowly it seemed almost painful, he reached out and took it from her small hand. His fingers were pale, long, impossibly graceful. They dwarfed hers completely, but his touch was gentle. He unfolded the paper carefully, as if it were made of something precious and fragile. And he read, "Thank you for helping my mom. You are not scary. You are good. Emma." For a moment, something flickered across his face. Something almost like surprise, or perhaps pain, or perhaps something he had no name for. He looked at Emma. "You are wrong," he said softly. "I am not good." Emma frowned, her small face scrunching up in disagreement. "Yes, you are. You helped us." "I have done terrible things," Cale said. His voice was heavy, laden with centuries of regret. "Things you cannot imagine. Things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life. But you helped us," Emma repeated stubbornly. She took another step closer. "That means you're good." Cale said nothing. His jaw tightened. His eyes burned brighter for just a moment, then dimmed again. Emma tilted her head, studying him the way children study things they don't yet understand but are determined to figure out. "My mom says people can change," she said. "She says it doesn't matter what you were. It matters what you do. And you did something good. So that makes you good." Cale's jaw worked silently. He looked down at the note again, at the carefully printed words, at the crooked letters formed by a 7-year-old's hand. "You are not scary. You are good." And then, for the first time in decades, he smiled. It was faint, barely there, a ghost of an expression that flickered across his face and disappeared almost before it began. But it was real. "Your mother is wise," he said quietly. Emma's face lit up with a grin, so bright it seemed to push back the darkness itself. From that night on, something shifted. Emma began visiting Cale in the basement. Not every night, but often. She would slip down the stairs after her mother fell asleep, clutching a new drawing or a story she'd written in school, or sometimes just herself. And Cale, ancient, solitary, haunted, found himself listening. She would sit cross-legged on the cold stone floor, talking about her day, about the teacher who gave her a gold star, about the boy in her class who was mean to everyone but especially to her, about the book she was reading with a princess and a dragon, about her mother's smile when the fever finally broke for good. She showed him her drawings, page after page of crayon and pencil and marker, castles and knights and stars, and always him. She asked him questions. Where did he come from? How old was he? What was it like to live forever? Did he sleep? Did he dream? Was he lonely? Cale rarely answered, but when he did, his words were careful, measured, as if each one cost him something. "I am older than this city," he said once, "older than this country. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have walked through centuries as if they were days. Do you get bored?" Emma asked. Cale was silent for a long time. "Yes," he admitted finally, "but not in the way you might think. It is not boredom that weighs on me. It is emptiness, the sense that nothing matters because nothing lasts." "I matter," Emma said simply. Cale looked at her, really looked at her, at this small, fragile, impossibly brave child who had walked into his darkness and refused to be afraid. "Yes," he said softly, "you do." He didn't understand why she wasn't afraid, why she kept coming back. Children feared the dark. They feared things with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. They feared monsters. And he was a monster. Of that, there was no doubt. But she looked at him and saw something else. Something he had thought was lost forever. She saw him, not the vampire, not the killer, not the creature of nightmare and legend, but the man he had been, buried so deep beneath centuries of blood and shadow that even he had forgotten. And so he didn't send her away. He let her sit with him in the candlelight, let her chatter and draw and ask questions, let her presence fill the empty spaces that had grown so vast inside him, because for the first time in centuries, he wasn't alone, And that changed everything. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the city in silence, muffling the noise of traffic and voices, and the endless hum of human life. The apartment building at 47th and Mercer looked almost peaceful under its white shroud, almost like it could be something more than what it was. Icicles hung from the fire escapes like crystal daggers, and the streetlights cast halos of gold to the falling flakes. But beneath the surface, things were changing. Sarah had started to recover. Slowly. Her illness was chronic, incurable, but with rest and the absence of constant terror, she had begun to regain some strength. She could stand without trembling now. She could make it to the kitchen without needing to stop and catch her breath. She could smile at her daughter again, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. The nights were still hard. Pain still crept through her bones in the small hours before dawn, but fear no longer lived in her chest like a stone. The men who had haunted her doorway, who had turned her home into a prison, were gone, and she knew, somehow impossibly, that they would not return, because he was watching. And Emma, bright, stubborn, impossible Emma, had bloomed. She laughed more, drew more, talked endlessly about the tall man in the basement, who told her stories about old wars and forgotten kingdoms and nights when the stars were different. She spoke of him with the kind of reverence children usually reserve for superheroes. And Sarah had learned not to correct her, because the truth was stranger than any story Emma could invent. Sarah should have been worried. Any rational mother would be. Her 7-year-old daughter was spending time alone with a creature that defied explanation, something ancient, powerful, and undeniably dangerous. But every time she saw the way Cale looked at Emma, with that strange, ancient gentleness, like he was seeing someone else through her, she knew her daughter was safe. Safer, perhaps, than she had ever been. The visits had become routine. Every few nights, after dinner and homework and the bedtime rituals that gave structure to their fragile life, Emma would slip out of the apartment. Sarah never stopped her. She would simply watch from the doorway as her daughter descended the stairs, small and fearless, toward the basement that no one else dared enter. And hours later, Emma would return, her eyes bright with wonder, clutching drawings or small objects Cale had given her, a smooth black stone, a tarnished coin from a country that no longer existed, a feather from a bird Emma had never seen in any book. He showed me how knights used to fight, Emma said one night, bouncing on her toes as she described intricate sword techniques she couldn't possibly understand but recounted with perfect detail. And he told me about a castle made of white stone that stood by the sea. He said he lived there once. Before. Before what? Sarah asked gently. Emma's expression grew somber. Before he changed. Before he lost everything. Sarah's chest tightened. She pulled Emma close, kissed the top of her head. He's not scary, Mom, Emma whispered. Everyone thinks monsters are scary. But he's not. He's just sad. Cale, for his part, found himself doing something he hadn't done in centuries. Remembering. Not the bloodshed. Not the centuries of violence and hunger. But the life before. The life he had buried so deep he thought had turned to dust. Emma had a way of asking questions that pierced through the armor he had built around himself. Did you have a family? She asked one night, sitting cross-legged on the stone floor of his chamber, her small hands working a piece of charcoal across paper. Cale had been silent for a long time. Finally, yes. What were they like? Another pause. Longer. My daughter, he said slowly, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, was brave. Like you, she did not fear the dark. She would climb the tallest trees in the orchard just to see the sunrise first. Emma looked up. What was her name? Cale's jaw tightened. Elara. That's pretty, Emma said. Then, softer, what happened to her? Cale's eyes fixed on the candle flame. Between them, the light danced, and in it he saw ghosts. There was a plague, he said. It swept through our lands like fire through dry grass. I was a lord then. I had wealth, power, land, but none of it mattered. I watched her waste away in my arms. I begged the physicians, the priests, the scholars, but no one could save her. His voice dropped to a whisper. And when she died, I made a choice, a terrible choice. I sought out something forbidden, something dark. I made a pact with forces that should never be touched. I traded my humanity for the strength to never be helpless again. Emma's eyes were wide, but not afraid. Did it work? Cale's laugh was bitter. Yes, I became immortal, powerful, invincible. He looked at his hands that could crush stone, that had ended countless lives. But I was too late, and the cost was everything I had left. Do you regret it? Emma asked quietly. Cale met her gaze. Every moment of every endless night. Emma set down her charcoal. She stood, walked over to him, and did something that shocked him to his core. She hugged him. Her small arms barely reached around his massive frame, her head pressed against his chest. And for a moment, Cale forgot how to breathe. I don't think you're a monster, Emma said, her voice muffled against his coat. I think you're just someone who lost everything and didn't know how to be okay after. Cale's hands hovered in the air, uncertain. Then, slowly, carefully, he placed one hand on her back. You remind me of her, he said softly, of the best parts of what I was. Emma pulled back, looked up at him, and smiled. Then maybe you can remember how to be that again. But safety, Sarah had learned, was a fragile thing. One evening in mid-December, just as the city began preparing for the holidays, there was a knock at the door. Sarah froze. She had been folding laundry, one of the small domestic tasks that made her feel almost normal again. Emma was at the table, drawing another picture of the castle by the sea Cale had described. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. Sarah's hands trembled. The towel she was holding slipped from her fingers. Emma looked up from her drawing, her face suddenly serious. Mom. It's okay, baby, Sarah said, though her voice betrayed her. Stay there. She moved to the door slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The floorboards creaked under her feet. She could feel sweat forming at the base of her neck, despite the cold. She peered through the peephole, and her blood ran cold. It was him, the older man, the one with the cruel smile, the one Cale had broken and sent running into the night 3 months ago. He stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 others. These men were different, bigger, broader, with the look of professionals. One had a scar running from his temple to his jaw. The other wore a leather jacket despite the cold, his hands shoved in his pockets in a way that suggested he was concealing something. And in the older man's hand, held loosely at his side but unmistakable, was a gun, a revolver. Chrome, 6 chambers. Sarah's breath stopped in her throat. Open the door, Sarah. The man called. His voice was sickeningly calm, almost conversational. We need to talk. Sarah's hand shook. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. How'd he find us? Why did he come back? Cale said, I can hear you breathing in there. The man continued. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Emma stood, her small hands clenched into fists. Mom, should I? Go, Sarah whispered urgently. Go get. The door exploded inward. The frame splintered. The lock tore free. The door swung open with such force it slammed against the wall, leaving a dent in the plaster. The men moved fast. The leader stepped inside first, gun raised, eyes scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The other 2 followed, spreading out. The one with the scar carried a crowbar, its metal head scratched and dented from use. The one in the leather jacket pulled out a hunting knife, 8 inches of serrated steel that caught the light. Well, the older man said, smiling that same cruel smile, looks like we're picking up where we left off. Sarah instinctively stepped in front of Emma, shielding her daughter with her own body. Please, Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. Please, just leave. We don't have anything. We haven't told anyone. We? Oh, I'm not here for money, the man interrupted. He raised a gun, pointing it directly at Sarah's chest. The barrel was a black hole, infinite and final. I'm here because you made a fool of me. You and that thing you had protecting you. Emma's eyes went wide with fear, and something else. Recognition. Understanding. Where is he, huh? The man continued, stepping closer. His boots left wet prints on the floor. Your monster? Your pet? Because I brought friends this time. Professional friends. And I don't care how big he is, how fast he is, or what he thinks he is. He cocked the gun, the sound sharp and metallic. Bullets work on everything. The man with the scar laughed, a low, ugly sound. Big guy gives us trouble. We put him down like a dog. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. Her mind was spinning, searching for options, for escape routes, for anything. There was nothing. The apartment was small. One room, one door. And these men were blocking it. Emma's small hand found Sarah's, squeezed tight. And then the lights went out. All of them. Every bulb in the apartment. Every light in the hallway. The entire floor plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Not the darkness of a power outage. This was different, deeper, as if the shadows themselves had risen up and swallowed the light whole. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. In an instant, breath became visible mist. The men cursed, fumbling for flashlights. What the... The one with the knife started. But before they could react, he was there. Cale moved like death itself. Silent, inevitable, inescapable. The first man, the one with the crowbar, didn't even see him coming. One moment he was standing, flashlight beams sweeping across the room. The next, something massive and impossibly fast collided with him. There was no struggle, no fight, just a single devastating impact. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the floor. The crowbar clattered away, spinning across the tile. The second man spun, knife raised, shouting something incoherent. A pale hand shot out of the darkness and caught his wrist mid-swing. There was a sickening crunch, the sound of bones grinding against each other, splintering under pressure that no human hand could generate. The man screamed, a high, piercing wail that echoed through the building. Cale tossed him aside like a rag doll. The man hit the wall hard, slumped down and didn't move. And then Cale turned to the leader. The older man stumbled backward, his flashlight beam shaking wildly as he swept it across the room. The light caught Cale for just a moment. He stood in the center of the apartment, towering and still, his coat billowing despite the absence of wind. His eyes burned crimson in the darkness. 2 points of hellish light that cut through the shadows. Jesus Christ, the man whispered. He raised his gun, hands shaking so badly the barrel wavered, and fired. Bang. The shot was deafening in the small space. The bullet hit Cale square in the chest. The impact tore through fabric, should have shattered bone, should have dropped him instantly. Cale didn't flinch. The man fired again. Bang. And again. Bang. 3 shots. Point-blank range. All 3 hit center mass. And Cale stood unmoved. The bullets had torn through his coat, leaving ragged holes. But beneath, impossibly, horrifically, his skin was unmarred, unbroken, as if the bullets had struck stone. Cale tilted his head slightly, studying the man like a predator watching wounded prey. "You wasted your chance," he said softly. His voice was calm, almost sad. The man's face went white. The gun slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the floor with a dull thunk. Cale stepped forward. The man stumbled backward, tripping over debris, falling hard onto his back. He scrambled away, but there was nowhere to go. Cale loomed over him, his shadow swallowing the man whole. His eyes blazed brighter, and the air around him seemed to hum with barely restrained power. "I warned you," Cale said. His voice was low, final, the voice of someone pronouncing judgment. "I told you what would happen if you returned. I told you what I would do." The man whimpered. Tears streamed down his face. Cale leaned down, his face inches from the man's. Up close, his features were even more terrifying, beautiful and monstrous, human and utterly other. "You thought bringing guns would save you," Cale said. "You thought hiring killers would make you strong." He paused. "You were wrong. Please," the man gasped. "Please, I'm sorry You will leave the city tonight," Cale interrupted. "You will take your men and disappear. You will never speak of this, never return, never even think of this woman or her daughter again." He straightened slightly, his crimson gaze boring into the man's skull. and you will spend the rest of your miserable life knowing that you were spared only because a child asked me to show mercy." The words hung in the air like a curse. "Now go." The man scrambled to his feet, nearly falling again in his haste. He ran, fled, stumbling over the threshold, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The other two men, one barely conscious, the other cradling his broken wrist, dragged themselves after him. Within seconds, they were gone. The sound of a door slamming, footsteps fading, an engine starting, then silence. Slowly, the lights flickered back on. Sarah stood frozen against the far wall, clutching Emma to her chest. Both of them were shaking. Cale turned to face them. His expression was unreadable. His coat hung torn and damaged, the bullet holes clearly visible. But beneath, his skin was perfect, untouched. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was gentle now. All trace of the cold fury from moments ago had vanished. Sarah shook her head, unable to speak. Her throat was too tight. Her mind was still trying to process what she had just witnessed. Emma, however, pulled away from her mother and stepped forward. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice was small but steady. Cale's expression softened, a subtle shift but unmistakable. "You should not have to thank me for this," he said. "But I do," Emma replied. She walked closer, looking up at him with those wide, fearless eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked. Cale blinked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I am unharmed," he said. "That's not what I asked." Cale stared at her for a long moment. Then, something in his chest, something he thought had died centuries ago, stirred. "No," he admitted quietly. "I am not." Emma reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers barely wrapped around one of his. "It's okay to not be okay," she said simply. Later that night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep, curled up in her mother's arms, exhausted from fear and adrenaline, Sarah found herself unable to rest. She sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the repaired door. Cale had fixed it himself, replacing the shattered frame with what he had somehow procured from the depths of the basement. It was sturdy now, secure, but Sarah knew the truth. The door didn't matter. The locks didn't matter. The only thing keeping them safe was him. She stood, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and walked to the window. And there, standing in the snow-covered street below, was Cale. He stood perfectly still, looking up at the building, a silent sentinel, a guardian carved from shadow and ancient regret. Sarah opened the window slightly, cold air rushing in. "You don't have to do this," she called down softly. Cale looked up. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Yes," he said, "I do." An hour later, Sarah found him on the roof. She didn't know how she knew he would be there. But when she climbed the stairs and pushed open the rusted door, there he was, standing at the edge, looking out over the city. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear. Stars glittered like broken glass. "Why?" Sarah asked quietly. Cale didn't turn. "Why what?" "Why protect us?" Sarah stepped closer, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "You don't know us. We're nothing to you. Just two more people in a city full of people." Cale was silent for a long time. The wind moved through his hair, dark and longer than she had realized. He looked almost human in that moment. Almost. "I was human once," he said finally. "Long ago. I had a family. A daughter." Sarah's breath caught. She was young, bright, full of life. His voice was distant, hollow, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "There was a plague. It swept through our lands like wildfire. I was a lord, wealthy, powerful, connected, but none of it mattered. I watched her waste away. I held her as she died." He paused. "And when she was gone, I could not bear it. I sought out something forbidden, something dark. I made a pact with forces that should never be touched. I traded my humanity for the strength to never be helpless again." He turned to face Sarah. His eyes were no longer glowing. They were just sad. "But strength without purpose is just violence," he said. "And for centuries, that is all I was, a creature of rage and hunger. I told myself I was surviving, but I was just hollow. What changed? Sarah asked. Cale's gaze shifted to the window of apartment 4C, where Emma slept. Your daughter, he said simply. She looked at me and saw someone worth saving. She reminded me that I was human once, that I cared once, that I loved once. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She sees you, Cale continued softly. Not as I am, but as I was, and perhaps as I could be again. He moved toward the door, his massive frame moving with impossible grace. You are safe now, he said. That I promise. No one will harm you again, not while I stand. Wait, Sarah said. Cale stopped. You don't owe us anything, Sarah said. You've already done so much. I owe your daughter everything, Cale replied. She gave me back something I thought was lost forever. What? Cale looked back at her. Hope. And then he was gone. Spring came. The snow melted. The streets thawed. And life in the city returned to its usual chaos. Car horns, street vendors, the endless rhythm of a million lives intersecting and diverging. But in the building at 47th and Mercer, something had changed. Sarah found steady work at a small bookstore 3 blocks away. The owner was kind, asked few questions, and didn't mind when Sarah occasionally needed to leave early for doctor's appointments. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to buy groceries. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to start building something that looked almost like a future. Emma went back to school. She made friends, real friends, the kind who invited her to birthday parties and asked her to sit with them at lunch. Her drawings covered the walls of the apartment now, bright splashes of color in a space that had once felt like a prison. And every so often, when the nights grew long and the world felt too heavy, a little girl would slip down to the basement, and there, in the candlelight, she would sit with a king who had forgotten how to be human. She would tell him about her day, about the books she was reading, about the boy in her class who pulled her hair, about the teacher who praised her artwork. And Cale would listen. He spoke less than she did. But when he did speak, it was with a gentleness that surprised him as much as it did her. He told her stories. Old stories. About knights and dragons. About castles and seas. About a world that existed before the one she knew. And slowly, so slowly he barely noticed it happening, the weight he had carried for centuries began to lift. He was still a monster. He knew that. The hunger still gnawed at him in the small hours before dawn. The darkness still called to him. But now, when Emma looked at him with those bright, fearless eyes and smiled, he remembered what it felt like to be something more. One evening in late May, as the sun set in brilliant streaks of orange and gold, Emma brought Cale a gift. She had folded a piece of paper into a star. It was lopsided, the points uneven, the creases not quite sharp. But it was perfect. I learned how to make these in art class, she said proudly. The teacher says stars are symbols of hope, so I made you one. Cale took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. He stared at it for a long moment, and then, for the second time in 300 years, he wept.